they gave us exactly what we asked for. The expulsion order passed 14-1. Humanity's seat on the Galactic Council, the seat they'd clawed for, bled for, embarrassed themselves in front of 17 species to earn, was formally revoked on a Tuesday. Or the alien equivalent of a Tuesday. A slow, administrative day. The kind of day you schedule bad news because the universe feels slightly less dramatic before the third solar cycle. The vote was clean. The language was polite. The council cited irreconcilable behavioral divergence, which is a bureaucratic way of saying humanity made us uncomfortable and, we've run out of patience. 3 Valorian delegates were seen visibly relaxing in their flotation harnesses as the final tally came through. The Sirith representative sent a private message to his homeworld that our intelligence services later recovered. 4 words. Finally. It is done. There was a reception afterward. Mild refreshments. Somebody made a toast. And then, and this is the part nobody talks about anymore, because it is embarrassing, because it is the kind of thing that ends careers and haunts retirement speeches, they let humanity go. Not banished. Not imprisoned. Not contained. Released. Into the galactic dark. Into unclaimed space. Into the lone, cold frontier the council had spent 40 years quietly agreeing not to touch, not to map, not to think too hard about. They handed humanity the void like a punishment. I know what happened next. I was there. My name is Secondary Logistics Arbiter Karathvel, and I have spent the last 19 months trying to write this report without my mandibles locking up. I will try again now. I keep a log. Not because I'm required to, my rank doesn't mandate it, and, frankly, the Council's filing system would bury anything I submitted under 47 layers of cross-departmental review before a single analyst read it. I keep a log because my secondary cognition cluster tends to spin without something to anchor it. My therapist, a Myra-T mindworker I see twice a cycle, calls it recursive catastrophizing. My supervisor calls it why Karathvel is annoying at briefings. I call it the thing that kept me alive for 19 months in a sector that wasn't supposed to have anything alive in it. So, the log. Day 1 post-expulsion, I was stationed aboard the Deliberate Horizon, a mid-range council observer vessel assigned to monitor human departure compliance. That's the official designation. What it actually meant, make sure they left. Count their ships. Document the trajectory. File the paperwork proving humanity vacated its designated space lanes in accordance with Expulsion Addendum 7, Clause 12, Subparagraph D, which nobody had ever used before because nobody had ever been expelled before, and the language had been drafted by a committee that assumed expulsion would involve more crying and less what the humans actually did. There were 41 of us aboard the Horizon. Logistics staff, 2 diplomatic observers, a handful of signals techs. Nobody military. Nobody expected to need to be. The humans had 114 registered vessels. Colony ships, mostly. Some freight haulers. A cluster of what the registry listed as multipurpose exploration craft, which the Council's Intelligence Division had noted with mild interest and, then, filed under probably fine. I watched them go on the observation deck. The last human ambassador, a woman named Director Calloway, whose name I've looked up 17 times because I keep misremembering it and my logs are supposed to be accurate, had stood in the council chamber 2 days earlier and said, very quietly, that she wanted it noted for the official record that humanity accepted the council's decision without contest. The room had gone slightly strange when she said it that way. Not protested. Not appealed. Not requested reconsideration. Accepted. The Valorian delegate told the chamber it was a mature response. The Sirith representative nodded. The Theric contingent made the sound they make when something is settled, a low harmonic thrum that resonates in the chest cavity even if you don't have a chest cavity. Nobody mentioned that Director Calloway had smiled while she said it. I had been in the observation gallery. I saw the smile. I've been thinking about it since. The Horizon followed the human fleet at a respectful distance of 12 light minutes for the first 72 hours. Standard compliance monitoring. I drank my ration tea, rehydrated, slightly chemical, the texture of something that had given up on being food and was now just a warm substance, and watched the feed from our long-range sensors and wrote in my log and tried not to feel what I was feeling. What I was feeling was a low, persistent unease that my secondary cognition cluster kept trying to classify and failing. Not threat assessment. The humans were leaving. They were compliant. They had registered their departure vectors, cleared their beacon identifiers, and were moving in clean, orderly formation toward the frontier boundary at exactly the speed the expulsion order required. Too orderly, the small unclassified thing in my chest kept noting. I told it to stop. The Horizon's captain was a Myra T officer named Sec Commander Thren, who had done this posting because it was supposed to be paperwork and transit time and a quiet commendation at the end. Thren had 4 upper limbs and spent approximately 60% of any given hour using 2 of them to fill out compliance forms on a secondary terminal, while the other 2 held a thermal vessel of something that smelled aggressively herbal. I'd asked once what it was. Solace root, Thren had said. For the headaches. Thren had very bad headaches. I did not yet understand why. The first thing I noticed, the first thing I logged, because I notice everything and log most of it, and my therapist says this is a coping mechanism, and I say yes, obviously. What's your point? Was the way the human ships communicated. We were monitoring their standard band transmissions as part of compliance protocol. Routine. Boring. Mostly navigational data, internal cargo manifests, the occasional burst of something our translation arrays identified as music, which we had 17,000 research hours on and still couldn't fully parse because it kept doing things with rhythm that our models hadn't predicted. But, between the standard transmissions, there was chatter. Not encrypted. Not coded. Just chatter. Casual. The translation layer rendered it in flat consensus standard and it still somehow conveyed tone, which is unusual. Most species lose tone in translation. Humans don't. Their language carries it structurally, or maybe it's something else, some quality of delivery that survives the rendering process. I have a fragment from the first day saved in my log. It is between 2 individuals aboard one of the freight haulers, registry designation HV Cargo 7. The translation renders their designations as Esposito and Marcus. Esposito, so this is it, huh? Marcus, looks like. Esposito, you nervous? Marcus, 4-second pause, nope. Esposito, you're lying. Marcus, absolutely. Then, the transmission window closed. Routine traffic. I listened to it 4 times. My secondary cognition cluster, the one that catastrophizes, the one that spins, it had flagged the exchange. I told it the exchange was insignificant. 2 crew members discussing their situation. Irrelevant to compliance monitoring. It disagreed. I told it to file a minority report with itself and leave me alone. It kept spinning. On the 3rd day, I filed my first preliminary compliance report. All indicators nominal. Human fleet maintaining required trajectory. No deviation. No contact attempted with Council-registered space. The report took me 40 minutes to write and would take an analyst 4 seconds to file and 6 months to review. I sent it. I drank my tea. I watched the ships. On the 4th day, something small happened that I didn't include in the official report and have thought about nearly every day since. One of the human vessels, a midsize unit, listed in the registry as multipurpose exploration, the kind of designation that covers essentially everything, dropped briefly out of formation. Just briefly. Maybe 9 minutes, by our reckoning. It moved laterally, maybe 400 kilometers, and then rejoined the formation. I flagged it in my personal log. I did not flag it in the compliance report because there was no protocol requiring me to flag 9-minute lateral deviations of under 500 kilometers. The protocol had been written for deviation events. This wasn't deviation. This was a correction. Or a systems check. Or nothing. When I reviewed the sensor data that evening, I noticed the vessel had adjusted its position in the formation. Not dramatically. It was now 3rd row, central. Before the maneuver, it had been outer right, trailing. Central formation position. Protected from lateral sensor sweeps. Shielded by surrounding mass on 3 sides. I stared at that for a while. Then, I went to sleep, because my body required it, and I dreamed about Director Calloway's smile, which is not a nightmare exactly but is something my therapist would call productive material and I call extremely annoying. The frontier boundary is not a line. There's no physical marker. It's a coordinate set, a bureaucratic designation, the place where council mapped space ends and everything else begins, and everything else is the polite term for a volume of space the council had surveyed in pieces over 4 centuries and quietly agreed to leave alone. Not because it was dangerous. Because it was complicated. Old survey data referenced what the reports called legacy infrastructure in several sectors. Not inhabited, nothing active, nothing communicating, but present. Structures. Remnants. The kind of things that, if you were a Sirith delegate with a long institutional memory, you might describe as cautionary. Humanity knew about the legacy infrastructure. The Council's survey data was technically public record, accessible in the archive. You could look it up. We had never thought to check whether they had. Director Calloway's fleet crossed the frontier boundary at 0300 on day 7. I was awake. I had been awake for approximately 19 hours at that point, which my body was loudly protesting, but my secondary cognition cluster was doing something I can only describe as pointing, and I couldn't make it stop. I watched the fleet cross on the sensor feed. The ships didn't scatter. They didn't slow down. They moved through the boundary in formation, still orderly, still clean, and then, on the other side, the formation changed. They had been traveling as a convoy. Freight model. Cargo ships flanking colony vessels, exploration craft at the perimeter. On the other side, the exploration craft moved inward. The colony ships moved outward. The freight haulers, which my log noted were the heaviest hulls in the fleet, the most shielding, the most structural mass, rotated 90 degrees and spread across the rear. Not a convoy formation. A screen. I stared at it. I pulled up every fleet formation database we had access to on the horizon. Military. Civilian. Historical. Survey. The closest match, the closest structural analog, was a deep-range military advance pattern. Species of origin, Theric. 4th era Theric, specifically. Pre-council. The kind documented in museum archives and footnotes about conflicts the council preferred to call formative periods rather than wars. The humans had formed up like a species going somewhere on purpose. I wrote in my log for 45 minutes. I don't remember exactly what I wrote. When I read it back later, the syntax was degraded, which means my cognition clusters were running hot and the translation between thinking and writing had gotten lossy. The last line was clear, though. I can still read it perfectly. They knew exactly where they were going. I want to be precise about what happened over the next 9 days, because there is a version of this story that gets told as a comedy, the council bureaucrats watching the screen, slowly realizing, and I understand the appeal of that version. It is funny. In the way that things are funny when they are also slightly terrible. But I was there. And what I remember is not comedy. What I remember is standing at the observation console in the horizon's monitoring bay with my tea going cold in my secondary hand, watching a species that had just been expelled from the interstellar community begin quietly, efficiently, without any announcement, to occupy the frontier. Not chaotically. Not desperately. Methodically. The first relay beacon appeared on day 8. A human-manufactured signal repeater, anchored at a coordinate that our survey maps listed as unremarkable empty space. Standard installation. The kind of thing you place when you're planning on being somewhere for a while. The second appeared on day 9. By day 12, there were 11 of them, and they formed a communication network spanning approximately 40 light-years. I filed a report on day 10. The analyst response came back on day 14. It thanked me for the observation and noted that the humans were technically within their rights to establish infrastructure in unclaimed space. No action required at this time. I read that 3 times. Then, I went back to my tea. It was cold. I drank it anyway. It tasted like a warm substance that had accepted its situation. On day 16, I will always remember day 16, one of the human exploration craft sent a short band transmission on an open frequency. Not to us. We were 12 light minutes back, in compliance monitoring range. The horizon wasn't even in the transmission cone. The transmission was outward facing. Toward a specific coordinate in the deep frontier. Toward, as I verified against the archive's restricted survey data with a clearance level I technically had but had never used before, Sector Remnant 7 Keth. One of the legacy infrastructure sites. The transmission itself was brief. My arrays captured it and rendered the translation in flat consensus standard. 4 words. Hey. Anyone home? I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the night after either. On day 18, there was a response. I will save what the response was for my supervisor's report, because I am a professional and I do things in order, and also because I need 3 more days before I can write it down without my mandibles locking. But I will say this. When the response came back, when it arrived on our arrays like a stone dropped in still water, Sect Commander Thren set down the thermal vessel of Solace route, very slowly, on the console. And did not pick it up again. The horizon had a standing order not to enter the frontier boundary. I want to be clear about that. We were a compliance monitoring vessel. Observe. Log. Report. The frontier was legally unclaimed space, which meant it was also legally outside our operational mandate, which meant that everything I did for the next 43 days was technically a series of escalating violations of my posting terms, violations I documented carefully and, in full in my log, because my therapist says I have a compulsive need to confess to myself, and, because I have decided that if I am going to make career-ending decisions, I am at minimum going to have a detailed record of the reasoning. The reasoning was this: Sect Commander Thren, on day 18, after receiving the response from Sector 7 Keth and, after setting down the Solace route for what turned out to be the last time, turned to me and said, and I have this verbatim in my log, Karathvel. You keep records. Yes, I said. Keep a very detailed one of what happens next. Then, Thren ordered the horizon across the frontier boundary. Not aggressively. Not with any particular declaration. Just a quiet course adjustment, entered into the navigation system by Thren personally, at a velocity that the crew chief later described as technically civilian speed, technically. I drank my cold tea. I opened a new log entry. I started typing. The response from Sector 7 Keth had come in on a frequency the Council's communications arrays had classified as dormant. Not defunct. The Council's classification system distinguishes between dormant and defunct, because the Council has very strong feelings about precise terminology, which is one of the reasons it took them 3 years to expel humanity and cost them a species they are now going to spend a considerably longer time regretting. Dormant means, was active once. Went quiet. Not clear why. The signal was dormant for, I pulled the archive file, approximately 900 years. The response to humanity's transmission had reactivated it. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think the weight of it gets lost in the telling. 900 years. Whatever was in Sector 7 Keth had been quiet for 900 years, through survey missions, through Council expansion, through 4 recognized interstellar wars, through the rise and slow calcification of the most powerful governing body in charted space. It had not responded to any of that. It had responded, in under 18 hours, to a human in a mid-range exploration craft transmitting what my translation array could only render as a casual, slightly hopeful inquiry. Hey! Anyone home? My secondary cognition cluster had thoughts about this. I told it to stand in line. The restricted archive file on Sector 7 Keth was 47 pages of bureaucratic language wrapped around what was, at its center, a very simple and very old decision. The Council's founders, the original 7 species, before expansion, before membership grew to 23 and, then, contracted back to 16 and, then, had a very bad Tuesday, had surveyed the frontier in the early years. They had found the legacy infrastructure. They had sent probes. Some of the probes had returned. Some hadn't. The ones that returned had carried data. The data had been reviewed by the Founding Council and, then, sealed in the restricted archive under a designation I don't have the translation for precisely, but, which renders most closely as, problem for future administration. The file's executive summary, which is all most people ever see, if they access it at all, noted that Sector 7 Keth contains structures of apparent artificial origin, estimated age between 4 and 6,000 years, no active inhabitants detected, no response to contact attempts. The restriction note at the bottom, added by Etheric archivist approximately 300 years after the original survey, said, note, contact attempts discontinued after response events in years 7, 19, and 23 of the survey program. Nature of responses classified. Recommendation, maintain boundary. Permit natural observation only. Do not transmit toward Keth coordinates. Do not transmit toward Keth coordinates. In 47 languages, as I had noted. Including Valorian, Sirith, Myrati, Theric, all the founding species. All the current members. Not including human standard. Humanity had never been given the restricted file. Because humanity had been a member for only 31 years, and the file was sealed, and nobody had thought to check whether they'd found it independently through archive access rights. Nobody had thought to check. I will describe what we saw when the horizon cleared the last survey boundary and Sector 7 Keth came into resolution on our forward arrays. I will describe it precisely, because my log has it precisely, and because the imprecise version sounds like I am being dramatic, and I am not being dramatic. I am being a secondary logistics arbiter with a detailed record and a comprehensive anxiety disorder, and those two things together produce very accurate reporting. The structures were large. That is the least interesting thing about them, but it is where I start because it is where the mind starts, with size, with scale, with the primitive heuristic that large things require large attention. Large, then. Very large. The array's depth reading rendered a scale reference automatically, and the scale reference itself took several seconds to recalibrate because the first estimate had been flagged as a probable sensor error. It was not a sensor error. Beyond the structures, which I will return to, there were ships. Human ships. All 114 of them, in a configuration I had to rotate through 6 different analysis models before one of them returned a confident classification. Settlement pattern. Civilian deep range. The kind of formation used when a population intends to establish a permanent presence at a location and is organizing itself around infrastructure rather than transit. They had been across the boundary for 11 days. They had already stopped moving like refugees. They had started moving like people who had arrived. There was a human voice transmission running on the low-band frequency. Open, unencrypted, clearly not intended for us, a running internal channel, the kind a logistics team uses when they're coordinating ground operations. My translation layer picked it up passively. I caught a fragment. I always catch fragments. I am constitutionally incapable of not catching fragments. The voice I logged was female, brisk, carrying the particular cadence of someone managing 17 things while talking about only one of them. Marcus, I need the second survey team in Kethsea by 1400. Yes, inside. Yes, I cleared it. Stop asking me if I'm sure. Esposito, the beacon array needs a relay anchor at grid 7, not grid 8. Look at the terrain map. Yes, the terrain map. What other map would? Yes, that one. Yes. Go. Then, to someone apparently standing nearby, in a different register, they're responding to the grid markers. It's call and response. Every marker we place, they light up the corresponding structural node. I think they're being helpful. A pause. Yeah, I know. Wild, right? I stopped the playback. I sat with "they're being helpful" for approximately 4 minutes. I wrote in my log, they are talking about the structures as if the structures are responding to them. Either the human survey team has had a perceptual break of some kind, or something in Sector 7 Keth that has been dormant for 900 years is choosing to respond to humans specifically, in what the human coordinator is describing as helpful behavior. Then, I wrote, I am going to need more tea. Then, I went and made more tea. It was also bad. I drank it standing at the dispenser because I couldn't make myself walk away. Thren called a briefing. The Horizon's briefing room seated 12 and was currently containing 17 people, because word had moved through the ship the way news moves through a small contained vessel, which is to say instantaneously and with a quality of shared alarm that manifests as everyone suddenly having a reason to be in the same room. Thren stood at the front. "We are going to observe," Thren said. "We are going to document. We are going to report." A signals tech raised a secondary limb. "Sir, the restricted files contact prohibition does not apply to observation." "The prohibition specifically covers observation," Thren said, with the particular flatness of a voice that has made a decision and is not reopening it, is what we are doing. The tech lowered their limb. "I wrote in my log, Sect Commander Thren is using a definition of observation that the Council's compliance office would find interesting. Then, because I am constitutionally incapable of not being thorough, I agree with this definition. I am documenting my agreement. If this comes before a review board, I want it noted that I agreed of my own cognition and, not under duress, because it matters to me that the record is accurate even when the record is incriminating." The human called Marcus appeared on our visual feeds on day 21. He was inside one of the structures. I want to be careful about how I described what he was doing, because the easy description is exploring, and exploration implies a certain passivity, looking at things, recording them, moving carefully in unfamiliar space. That is not what Marcus was doing. Marcus was working. He had, and I reviewed this feed several times, checking the resolution, checking the enhancement filters, confirming what I was seeing. He had tools. Not survey instruments. Not scanning equipment. Tools. The physical kind, the kind that interact with materials directly. He was doing something to one of the structural nodes. Carefully. Methodically. With the particular focus of someone who is solving a problem that they have thought about for a long time and are now finally, physically, solving. The structural node, I cross-referenced our sensor data with the archive's dormant frequency mapping, corresponded to a relay point in the legacy communication network. The one that had been dormant for 900 years. The one that had reactivated when the humans transmitted. The relay point was damaged. The archive data mentioned it in a footnote. In the dry clinical language of old survey reports, Node 7C4 shows structural degradation consistent with age and unspecified impact event. Function, compromised. Compromised. 900 years ago. Marcus spent 4 hours at Node 7C4. When he left, I ran the dormant frequency array. Node 7C4 was active. I wrote in my log for 6 minutes. Then, I stopped, because what I was writing was essentially the same sentence repeated in different syntactic configurations, and that was my secondary cognition cluster doing the spin thing, and it wasn't useful. The sentence was, "He fixed it." The thing I couldn't stop adding, in various forms, was the follow-up question, how did he know it was broken? I put in a formal communication request to the human fleet on day 23. Not through official council channels, we were in an operational gray zone that made official channels complicated. A direct transmission, secondary arbiter to fleet, observer to observed, the kind of contact you technically weren't supposed to make without authorization, but that the compliance manual also didn't explicitly prohibit because the compliance manual had been written for a situation where humanity was leaving, not setting up relay networks in legacy sectors and repairing 900-year-old infrastructure. The response came from Director Calloway herself. I had expected a logistics officer. I had prepared questions for a logistics officer. Calloway's voice was even. Unhurried. The translation layer rendered it clearly, which I have already noted is unusual. Humans lose less in translation than almost any other species we've catalogued, and I have my own theory about why, but that is not this report. Secondary arbiter, she said. I wondered when you'd call. I said, Director. The Council's restricted survey data on Sector 7 Keth includes a prohibition on contact with the structures. You were not given this data. A pause. No, she said. We weren't. You accessed the archive independently. Not a question. She understood it wasn't a question. Humanity has had archive access rights since year 6 of our membership, she said. We read everything we were allowed to read. The restricted file has a public-facing summary. The summary mentioned legacy infrastructure and discontinued contact attempts. The restriction note mentioned response events in years 7, 19, and 23. Another pause. Shorter. We thought that was interesting. I said, the Council's decision to discontinue contact was based on the nature of the response events, which are classified. Yes, Calloway said. I know. The responses were, I know what the responses were, she said. I stopped. My tea was cold again. They weren't hostile, she said. The responses. The archive classified them because they were unprecedented and the founding council didn't have a protocol for unprecedented. So they marked it do not engage and filed it and waited for someone else to deal with it. She said this without any particular inflection. We read that, she said, and we thought, well, someone has to. I did not transmit my day 23 log entry in the official report. I am including it here, in the full document, because I said I would be thorough and I am a professional and also because I think the person who eventually reads this archive needs to understand what I understood on day 23. The Council expelled humanity because humanity was uncomfortable to be around. Too reactive. Too variable. Too willing to do things that broke precedent and, then, apologize afterward rather than asking permission first. Irreconcilable behavioral divergence. They released humanity into the frontier as a punishment. The frontier, where the legacy infrastructure had been sitting for 6,000 years. Where the dormant frequency had been waiting 900 years for someone to respond. Where the archive's founding survey, sealed and classified, had noted response events and filed them under problem for future administration. The Council had sat on the border of this for 300 years and called it a cautionary footnote. Humanity had been here for 23 days. They had fixed a relay node. They had established a settlement pattern. They had, according to Calloway's calm, even voice, begun a working relationship with whatever lived in the infrastructure, whatever had been dormant, waiting, for 900 years, and considered it, apparently, a reasonable Tuesday. The Council's response to my preliminary report on day 27 was 4 words. Do not engage further. Thren read it. Put it in the file. Ordered the horizon to hold position. We held position. We watched. On day 29, a second structure in Kefsi lit up. On day 31, the human fleet's communication network integrated with the legacy frequency grid. On day 34, I want to be precise about this, the relay network, the one built 6,000 years ago by a species the Council had no designation for, began broadcasting outward. Not toward Council space. Deeper in. Further in. Into the parts of the frontier the survey program had never reached. Broadcasting in human standard. I wrote in my log, they are making introductions. Then, I closed the log and sat in the dark monitoring bay with my cold tea and thought about the 14 delegates who had voted for expulsion on what was, for them, a slow administrative day. A quiet day. The kind of day you schedule bad news. I stopped drinking tea on day 40. This is not a metaphor. The Horizon's ration dispenser had been cycling the same thermal ration blend for 11 weeks, and, somewhere around day 38 I had processed approximately 46 units of it, and, on day 40 my secondary cognition cluster, which handles the background operations, the body monitoring, the things the primary cluster ignores when it's busy catastrophizing, quietly sent up a flag that said the thing you are ingesting is not actually helping and may be actively counterproductive. And, I looked at the cup in my hand and, I set it down and, I did not pick it up again. I replaced it with nothing, which is worse, but, at least the nothing was honest. I need to explain what happened on day 34, because I handled it in part 2 as a transition point and, it was not a transition point. It was the moment the shape of everything changed. When the legacy relay network began broadcasting outward deeper into the frontier, past the survey boundary, into the unsurveyed dark, I ran a frequency analysis. Standard monitoring procedure. I wanted to understand what was being transmitted. What was being transmitted was, according to my arrays, formatted data packets in human standard with a structural architecture consistent with Introductory Communication Protocol. Introductory Communication Protocol. The humans had designed a standard first contact message framework during their membership in the Council. I know this because the Council's Xenolinguistic Division had reviewed it in year 12 of human membership and filed it under Premature Initiative Review Pending, which is the Council's way of saying we don't want to deal with this right now. The framework had been tabled. Never officially deployed. Never given a formal Council sanction. The humans had deployed it anyway. Through infrastructure 6,000 years old. Into space the Council had never surveyed. I wrote in my log, they used the network as a broadcast amplifier. They spent 34 days not just establishing themselves here, they spent 34 days making this place transmit for them. They have sent a first contact signal with the range of a 6,000-year-old relay array. The Council has been trying to get Council-sanctioned first contact signals out for 3 centuries. The coverage radius of those signals is approximately 1/9 of what humanity just achieved on a Tuesday. Then, I added, with a network they fixed themselves. Then, I added, with tools. The response from the unsurveyed dark came on day 39. Not one response. Several. I want to be careful here. I am a secondary logistics arbiter. I am not a first contact specialist. I am not a xenolinguistic analyst. I am a person with very good record-keeping habits and a recently discontinued tea addiction and an increasingly concerning relationship with sleep, and the data I was receiving was outside my training classification by approximately 47 orders of magnitude. But, I recorded it. I recorded all of it. Because Thren had told me to keep very detailed records, and because the data was real, and because it was coming in fast, and because if nobody wrote it down it would be as if it hadn't happened, and the thing in my chest that spins, the catastrophizer, the pointer, the small nameless thing, was absolutely certain that it was happening. Multiple signals. Multiple sources. Multiple frequency signatures. Not all of them recent. This is the part that the Council's review board, when it eventually convened, which I will not describe in this document because I was asked not to, and because there are 16 other documents in this archive that cover it, and because I need to not think about the review board if I am going to finish this is the part the board found most difficult to process. The frequency analysis showed that some of the incoming signals were not new. Some of them were old. Some of them had the same temporal signature as the legacy infrastructure itself. Which is to say, whatever had been trying to respond to the Sector 7 Keth network for 6,000 years, whatever had been sending signals into a relay system that was damaged and dormant and silent, was still out there. Had been out there the whole time. Still transmitting. Into silence. And, now, for the first time in 900 years since the network last functioned, before the damage, before the dormancy, someone was receiving. I called Director Calloway again on day 41. I had been awake for 26 hours. My primary cognition cluster was doing its best. My secondary cluster had given up filing minority reports and was now just emitting a low persistent alarm that I had learned to treat as background noise the way some species learn to sleep through proximity signals. Calloway answered immediately. Arbiter, she said. Director. I looked at my notes. I had prepared questions again. The incoming signals. The ones from the unsurveyed sector. Yes. You're receiving them. Yes. And, the signals that have the legacy temporal signature, the ones that have apparently been transmitting for thousands of years, yes. You've made contact. A pause. Longer than her previous ones. We're in dialogue, she said. Contact implies a single event. This is, she stopped. Started again. There are multiple sources. They're not all the same. Some of them are close. Some of them are very far. Some of them are another stop. They're not all the same kind of thing. I wrote, not all the same kind of thing. My hand was doing something I'd later describe to my therapist as independent operation. Director, I said. The Council's restricted file on Sector 7 Kef. The response events in years 7, 19, and 23 of the original survey. The Founding Council sealed those records. Yes. You said you knew what the responses were. Yes. Tell me. The pause this time was long enough that I checked the transmission line to confirm it was still active. It was active. Calloway was thinking. The Founding Council sent probes, she said finally. The probes transmitted standard inquiry signals. Generic. Formal. The kind of signal you send when you want to announce presence without committing to anything. Standard protocol. The network responded, she said. 3 times. Years 7, 19, and 23. The nature of the responses was classified. The nature of the responses, she said, was questions. I wrote the word questions. The network or whatever was using it responded to the Council's formal inquiry signals by asking questions. In a language the Founding Council's xenolinguists spent 6 years analyzing. 47 questions, total, across the 3 response events. The Founding Council classified the responses because they couldn't answer them. Couldn't answer any of them. I wrote, couldn't answer. The questions were, Calloway said, and here her voice changed in a way my translation layer rendered as neutral but not neutral, about the species that built the network. About where they had gone. About whether the new species, the ones sending the probes, intended to stay or were passing through. About whether there was anyone, in all the space the new species had surveyed, who had ever thought to look deeper. Silence. Whether there was anyone, she said, who was actually interested. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it the way you sit with something that reorganizes several things simultaneously, not violently, not with the sharp drama of rupture, but with the slow, irreversible shift of tectonic things finding their new configuration. The Founding Council had received 47 questions from a 6,000-year-old network that had apparently been waiting for someone to be interested. They had classified the responses. They had filed them under problem for future administration. They had drawn a boundary and written do not transmit in 47 languages and had 17 deliberate meetings about the long-range survey program and had never sent another probe. They had sat on the border for 300 years and occasionally updated the cautionary footnote. And then, on a slow administrative Tuesday, they had expelled humanity, the species that read archive documents carefully, the species that showed up to things with tools, the species that transmitted, "Hey, anyone home?" into the dark because someone had to, and sent them into the frontier. To get rid of them. Thren came and stood beside me in the monitoring bay on day 43. We stood there for a while without talking. This is not unusual for Myra-T. Myra-T are comfortable with extended silences in a way that most species aren't, and Thren specifically had spent the last 2 weeks in what I can only describe as a very long, very deliberate process of reconsidering things. Thren had sent 17 formal reports to the Council. The Council had responded to 4 of them. The responses had said, in varying configurations of formal language, hold position, observe, do not engage, await further instruction. On day 43, Thren said, how many incoming signals are we currently tracking? I checked. Confirmed distinct sources, 31. Possible additional sources with incomplete data, 14 to 17. Depending on how you classify recurring frequency patterns from the same origin points. 31. Minimum, yes. In 43 days. In 9 days, technically. The first responses started on day 34. The rate of incoming signals has increased by approximately 40% every 4 days. Thren was quiet. The human fleet, Thren said. They're managing 31 incoming contact streams simultaneously? 31 confirmed. Possibly 48. Director Calloway has organized what she's calling, I checked the terminology I captured from their open channels, a contact desk. Multiple teams, rotating shifts, dedicated to individual contact streams. She said in a transmission I captured on day 40 that the Keth infrastructure functions as a translation buffer, which is why the incoming signals are comprehensible at all. Without it, they'd be receiving raw signal and have nothing to work with. The infrastructure they repaired. The infrastructure Marcus repaired on day 21, yes. Thren made a sound. I have spent many months trying to classify that sound. It wasn't quite any of the standard Myra-T emotional vocalizations. It was the specific sound, I eventually decided, of a mind that has been doing the math and has just finished the calculation and doesn't like the answer but can't argue with the arithmetic. The council, Thren said. Yes. The council expelled them. Yes. Into this. Yes. A very long silence. Karathvel, Thren said, I need you to draft a communication to the council. Priority channel. Full encryption. Commander's seal. Of course. What should it say? Thren turned and looked at me. Thren's eyes, Myra-T F3, the lateral pair and the deep focus central, were doing the thing they do when a Myra-T is experiencing something the language doesn't have a word for yet. Tell them, Thren said, that humanity has made first contact. I waited. Then, tell them, Thren said, to specify how many contacts. And, to keep going. Contacts, plural. Plural, Thren said. And, increasing. And, that every single incoming signal has, at some point in the initial exchange, asked the same question. Which question? Are there others? Other members of your kind? On the other side of the boundary? I wrote this down. Tell them, Thren said, and here Thren's voice did something I'd never heard Myra-T voices do, something the translation layers simply rendered as flat and, which I believe was not flatness at all but, the precise opposite that Director Calloway has told each of them, not yet. But, give us time. I sent the report. I did not replace the T. The council's response came through 48 hours later. Not 4 words this time. Not do not engage. A longer message, from a higher clearance level, with the kind of formal careful language that means the people writing it are afraid. The message asked several questions. It asked what the nature of the contacts was. It asked about potential threat assessments. It asked for timeline projections. It asked whether the human fleet could be brought back into compliance with the frontier boundary. I read it twice. I wrote my response carefully. I told them the nature of the contacts was, as best I could determine, mutual interest. I told them the threat assessment was, by every metric I had access to, non-applicable. I told them I could not provide a timeline projection because I was not qualified to project the behavior of 31 newly contacted entities in dialogue with a species that had been officially expelled from the Council 9 weeks ago. And, I told them, and here I was very careful, very precise, very thorough, because I am a secondary logistics arbiter with a detailed log and a discontinued T-habit and a secondary cognition cluster that points at things, and I have been pointing at this for 45 days, that bringing humanity back across the frontier boundary would require humanity's agreement. And that humanity, as of this report, had a provisional diplomatic network spanning 40 light-years, at minimum 31 active contact threads with previously unknown entities, a repaired relay infrastructure of unknown but apparently significant range, and the growing attention of things that had been waiting, in the dark, for someone to actually be interested. I told them that humanity, as of this report, was not going to agree. I told them that I suspected humanity had known, from the moment Director Calloway smiled in the council chamber, that it wasn't going to be a punishment. I told them the record should reflect that I had been monitoring the situation continuously and had documented everything and that I believed, in my professional assessment, that the council should read that record very carefully and, then, sit with it for a while before deciding what to do next. Then, I signed it. Secondary Logistics Arbiter Karathvel, ICV Deliberate Horizon, Day 45 post-expulsion. Then, I added one line. Not for the council. For the archive. For whoever reads these documents years from now, when the shape of everything has finished changing. They said it was a punishment. Director Calloway smiled. I understand why now. I still keep logs. I keep them more carefully now. Thren has stopped asking me to. I do it because the small nameless thing in my chest that points at things has not quieted, exactly. It has found a new direction. Outward. Deeper in. Into the parts of the frontier we haven't reached yet. There is a lot of it. And, on the horizon's open feed, whenever I'm in the monitoring bay, I can still hear the human contact desk running. The rotating shifts. The voices. Esposito and her relay markers. Marcus and his tools and his 4-second pauses. Director Calloway, even, sometimes brief, unhurried, speaking to something none of us have names for yet, in a tone that is the furthest thing from afraid. Last week I heard a fragment I did not include in the official report. Someone on the contact desk, I don't have the registry, I couldn't identify the voice, talking to whoever was on shift. Another one came in overnight. Southern sector, way out. Very old signal. They've been transmitting for a pause, a rustling sound, a sharp exhale, for about 3,000 years. They just want to know if we're staying. A silence. Then, from whoever was listening, what did you tell them? And, the voice, easy, certain, carrying in a way that bypassed every translation layer and arrived exactly as it was meant, told them yeah. We're staying. The council met 9 days ago. I don't know what they decided. I'm still here, at the frontier boundary, in the monitoring bay, with no tea and a full log and the light of the Ket structures on the forward array. The structures are bright. They've been getting brighter. Final entry, day 54. This document is complete. For the archive. For whoever reads it when the council has finished deciding what to do about the thing they handed to humanity as a punishment. Read it carefully. Then, look at the frontier. Then, look further.